I want to direct your attention one more time to a passage you know from James, Jesus' half-brother, which says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." The Lord over his church, Jesus Christ, he gave to his church, each of us, all of you who are truly in Christ have been gifted and then given to the church for the benefit of everyone. It's the same Lord who gives givers and administrators and helpers and servants of all kinds. That same Lord gives to the church teachers and leaders. So at first you might think, since he equally gives all of us to the church, all of us will be judged by him equally on the last day. But James says that's not true. Every one of us will be held responsible for what we do in the body, whether good or bad. If you're in Christ, your sins are all forgiven. There is no judgment of condemnation for you, but you will answer for every idle word. But when it comes to leaders, and in the church that includes teachers, we will have a stricter judgment than everyone else. I think the reason for that is the impact. Leaders have a multiplied impact. Now, every one of you are responsible for your brothers and sisters here. You are responsible to do the work of the ministry, to serve each other, to step in crises, to speak the truth in love. It's not like the leadership's job. That's everybody's job. But when a leader or a teacher from up front speaks as God has given him to speak, what he says, and then in his life what he does, it is multiplied in its impact on everyone else. So if you're in a small group Bible study and someone offers a sincere but a very sincerely wrong interpretation of a passage of Scripture, that has an effect, certainly. But when a leader offers a wrong interpretation of Scripture, that rumbles through your families and off into your future in ways you may not know. The impact is multiplied. That can be for good or for bad. You see this in the Old Testament fairly clearly when the leadership in Israel, the elders, they make a covenant with the Gibeonites. They were not supposed to make a covenant with anyone in the land, but the Gibeonites tricked the leaders. And the leaders, without asking any of the people, without asking the Lord, make that covenant. It's a foolish decision. And there are consequences for everybody else. And they're rightly upset about it. Now, it works the other way too. Leaders have a multiplied impact not just for bad, but also for good. It is one of the reasons we're grateful for good and healthy leadership on any level. That can be politically, that can be in the home, in the workplace, that can be in the church. When there is a leader who does right and says right, you feel the impact of it in your life in more ways than you probably understand. God, therefore, through Christ, has given to the church teachers and leaders, and when they teach what is right and sound and biblical, it benefits everyone. It is kind of like the role of priesthood in the Old Testament. The prophet Malachi said, God speaking through him, true instruction was in his mouth. That's the ideal. And no wrong was found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness, and he turned many from iniquity. For the lips of a priest should guard knowledge, and people should seek instruction from his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. Leaders and teachers have a multiplied impact on others, for good and for bad. I say that because we're returning today to this character from the Old Testament in 1 Samuel. His name is Saul. He is Israel's very first king. He's a leader over thousands and thousands of God's people. Unfortunately, he's a poor leader. We've already seen him sin significantly and lose the kingdom. Today, he adds to his sin from last chapter simple foolishness. He makes a foolish decision. You may remember the Philistines had come to attack the land of Israel, gathered en masse at Michmash. No one knew what to do. Saul, the king's son, Jonathan, went out with his armor bearer, and God gave them a great victory. The Philistines are now running away westward to the coast. Everything is going well until the king gets involved and makes a foolish decision, a rash vow. So let's look at his example negatively, and may God prevent us, any of us in leadership, from imitating him. Let's look at 1 Samuel 14. We're starting in verse 24. And the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I'm avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. Now, when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping. But no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint." Then Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found, for now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great." They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You've dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, 'Let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood.'" So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Saul was a leader, which of course means that his impact on others was multiplied for good and for bad. There were times when his impact for good was very clear. We saw him, God through him, rescue Israel from evil Nahash, king of the Ammonites, delivering the right eye of many of the Israelites. So that was a force for good. But of course it works the other way. And most of the time for Saul, he's not being a good leader. He is acting poorly. He's making poor decisions. That's typically what he's doing. And it leads us to say, poor followers. You yourself today may or may not be a spiritual leader in the church. However, all of you are under spiritual leadership if you're a member of a church. Beyond that, most everyone here is a leader of some kind. God has given you a multiplied influence through authority in some sphere. It could be in your workplace. You have authority over others. It could be in your home. If you're a husband, over your wife and children. If you are a mother, it's over your children. Most of us have some kind of authority. We're either under it. Some of you have authority. You are over others. So the Lord offers you this warning of a passage today, showing us in Saul how not to use your authority and leadership to have an impact on others that's multiplied for good and not for ill. And to that end, then, we're going to look at Saul today. We're going to consider first his poor decision as a leader, and then following that, we'll look at the poor followers who had to suffer the consequences of that. So let's begin with the poor decision, and that's completely contained in the first verse, verse 24. The men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So I really think that should be because Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." So none of the people had tasted food. That first line is actually quite a surprise. The men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. The reason that's a surprise is because if you saw last week, earlier in this chapter, the Philistines were hard pressed, not the men of Israel. The Philistines were the ones suffering defeat because of that bold attack that Jonathan and his armor bearer made. The Philistines were melting away, even though they were a massive army, melting away into the west, running beyond Bethaven as Israelites pursued them. Some Hebrews who were among the Philistines turned coat and attacked them. Others emerged from the caves they were hiding in, and then Saul's men, of course, were pursuing. So the Philistines are being driven away. So we expect to hear that the Philistines were hard-pressed. Instead, this passage opens by telling us it was the men of Israel who were hard-pressed. I think the other major translations, instead of so, have because, and I think that's more accurate rendering of the Hebrew. The men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day because Saul had laid an oath on the people. It is hard work to chase your enemy, so I hear, all the way across Israel, but it's not hard-pressed work. They are hard-pressed, I believe, because of Saul's oath. If you look at verse 31, it says, "They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon." Aijalon is westward. It's about 15 or 20-ish miles away. So you can just imagine on this day, the people of Israel, as the Philistines are melting away westward, they're pursuing them, and some of them have to pursue them 15, 20, or more miles. That's like a half marathon or maybe a full marathon in one day of chasing enemies and doing battle. It's a lot of calories that you expend. These people are exhausted. Unfortunately, Saul had made a very poor decision, which was an oath that he quickly made, which was, no one eats any food today until the sun goes down, till this evening. And so the consequence is obvious. Verse 28 ends, "And the people were faint." Of course they were. Verse 31, it intensifies, "And the people were very faint." Now, Saul's decision, was it sin? I don't know, not exactly. It wasn't like the sinful decision of the previous chapter Saul made when he offered the sacrifice without waiting all 7 days for Samuel. And it wasn't like the sin he'll commit in the next chapter when he refuses to obey the Lord and spares the Amalekite king and some of their flocks. Those are obvious sins which cost him the kingdom. What we have before us today is the leader in Israel just doing something silly, doing something that was foolish. It was not a good idea. It was not well thought out. This is just what we call a poor decision. It was a poor decision from this leader, Saul, first of all, because it lacked foresight, as pretty much all poor decisions do. Verse 30, Jonathan sees this very clearly. How much better, he says, if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. See, that's what Saul wanted, a great defeat among the Philistines. But he hadn't thought out how his rash vow would prevent what he wanted. If they don't have caloric intake, they will not have the strength to strike the Philistines the way they should. This could have been a great victory, maybe like the one they'd experienced long before at Mizpah, where the Philistines were driven away for years and years. But now it wasn't that way, and the Philistines will continue to be a threat to God's people in all the chapters moving forward. And that may be owing to, partly, Saul's poor decision to not allow the people to have food here. There was not forethought on how it would weaken the people. And secondly, it was a poor decision, maybe, because it had too much of himself in it. Look at this, his oath. "Cursed be the man who eats food until it's evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." Now, you might wonder why Saul even made an oath. Sometimes people would make an oath to make sure God was on their side when they were about to do something. But see, God was already doing something. God already had acted supernaturally, was driving a huge army of Philistines away. God had made the Philistines fight each other as well. All of this because two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer, had attacked. So clearly, God's already doing everything that needs to be done. And yet Saul, in the heat of the moment, I guess is the reason, makes this rash vow. It is a rash vow, by the way. That is what we would call it. The law in the Old Testament allowed, for example, when there was a new marriage, the husband, if his wife previously, when she was single, had made vows or bound herself by commitments, he could free her from those when he heard about them. Specifically, he could free her from, quote, her vows or any thoughtless utterance of her lips by which she has bound herself. That right there, thoughtless utterance of the lips by which she bound, that's what Saul did here. It was thoughtless. It wasn't thought out well. It was rash. It was in the moment, and now he's bound by it. The people are, at least. Probably the rash vow you know of best from the Old Testament was by the judge named Jephthah, who told the Lord, Lord, if you allow me to win a victory over our enemies, the Ammonites, then when I get home, whatever comes out of my house, I will sacrifice to you. Thinking, of course, whatever animal. But he gets home having won the victory, and his only daughter comes out of the house. That was a thoughtless utterance by which he bound himself. That's what we call a rash vow. So why did Saul make this vow? The only real explanation here, I suppose, would be it was in the heat of the moment. And you do see, again, some of himself in it. There is a zeal. Now, granted, he's the king of Israel. So when he speaks of his enemies, he is speaking of the Lord's enemies. That's true. But he puts it in this way on purpose. I will be avenged of my enemies. I think that's just some kind of misguided zeal exploding out of him as he sees the mass of the Philistines running away. And he yells out the oath that he puts upon the people very thoughtlessly, somewhat selfishly. It is a zeal, but it is not a zeal according to knowledge. That's the poor decision that he makes. It was misguided, but it is in keeping with everything we've seen in Saul. Saul is always right on the cusp of doing the right thing. He's always so close, but just not there. And most of that stems from the fact that Saul is focused on this life. He's always looking down or horizontally. He's never looking really up. The only times we see Saul focusing on the Lord is when he wants the Lord to do something horizontally for him. And maybe that's the meaning even of the last verse here in our passage when it says, and Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Maybe again referring to the fact that he'd been king now for some time, but his thoughts were not really focused upward. They were always outward, they were downward, not upward. And we see that again here. And because of that bad focus, in a moment of heat, he makes a rash vow, a poor decision. This, I think, is a lesson God intends for any of you here who lead in any way. Again, whether that's in the home, that could be the workplace. If you have any kind of authority over others, Saul is set before your eyes in this passage as a warning to you not to do what he did here in this passage. He was too fast. That was a lot of his problem in the heat of the moment. There is such a thing, and you all know this, as leadership that's too slow. Leadership that drags its feet and just doesn't make decisions, and that can be infuriating for whatever reason. They just don't move forward. Maybe they're scared of the consequences of it. So that doesn't work. But there's also such a thing as leadership that moves too quickly. And that is the temptation. When you are a leader, you have a level of authority that allows you to move too quickly. In other spheres of life where you don't have the authority, you have to work with others, you have to convince them. If you're in a leadership position like Saul is here, he can make that oath, and who can stop him? Leaders have an authority where they're able to push things through if they want to. They don't have to wait. It's wise to get buy-in, but sometimes they don't have to get buy-in. They don't have to hear your opinions about stuff. They can just do what they want to do. And if a leader's not careful, you can get used to that. And in moments of impatience, rashness, even of zeal, but misguided zeal, can make decisions you're so sure about, but you've not stopped to think about. That's exactly what Saul did here. I mean, the example is the husband who is certain that he sees his finances and his family with perfect clarity. And in a moment of excitement, he buys a boat, which is fine, by the way. But see, he didn't talk to his wife. In fact, he just shows up with the boat at his house. He can do that. What a terrible idea, though. There really should have been a discussion before there was a decision. And that's true in leadership. We want to have leadership that thinks things out. Because why? Because the decisions you make, if you have authority, have a multiplied impact on the people under you. And his wife's going to have to deal with the consequences of buying the boat. He should have thought that out. That's why a very rare but an essential quality in good leadership. You want to be a good leader? You have to cultivate that rare quality of really actually listening. And sometimes the leader types who are very successful and worldly standard in leadership are not those kind of people. They're the ones who make the hard decisions and move forward. But to be able to stop, to actually listen, to get wise counsel, to really think and then in a timely manner make a decision requires quite a bit of self-control. It's a self-control Saul didn't have. And so he makes his rash vow. He just throws it out there, not thought out. With some kind of selfish zeal, he makes a poor decision. Now, the poor decision is made in verse 24. The rest of our passage leads us to say, poor followers, which is now the second point of this message. The poor followers of this man who made this poor decision. Consider first poor Jonathan, Saul's son, starting in verse 26. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping. But no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. So he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand, and dipped it in the honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, "Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food this day.' And the people were faint. Then Jonathan said, 'My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great.'" The Lord called geographically this land, Israel, he called it a land flowing with milk and honey. And now you see, it is flowing with honey, or at least it is dripping with honey. Probably the idea is that it's dripping from trees onto the forest floor. And here come the people bound by Saul's rash oath. They can't taste any food at all. They've run half marathon or a full marathon. They enter the forest. They are famished. And they look around, and there is glistening golden honey oozing everywhere, full of sweetness, especially in the ancient world when diets were not comprised of very much that was sweet. This was quite appealing to have this honey around them. Now, Jonathan was not with Saul, because when Saul was doing nothing, Jonathan was doing something. With his armor bearer, he had attacked the Philistines, and by faith, they were now being driven away. So Jonathan did the most logical thing. What do you do if you're hungry and there's honey dripping around you? He reaches out his staff, gets a hold of some honeycomb, takes it with his hand, puts it to his mouth, and his eyes are brightened. His blood sugar levels are raised. He's cheered. His attitude goes up. When you're hungry and you eat, even the thought of eating, and then you eat, your attitude improves. That's what happened to him. And then, after doing the most logical thing, he learns about a very illogical, unpredictable decision his own father had made. Nobody eats anything. which makes no sense at all, as he explains. In fact, we're going to see next week that for no fault of his own, he didn't know about the oath, Jonathan will almost be put to death for eating that honey. Almost. Be very close to it. Poor decisions by poor leaders, that is how they feel, They can feel rather unpredictable and pretty illogical at times. So someone, and you can think of this in your workplace, in a church, wherever, government, someone in a closed room somewhere with no experience of what you're actually experiencing, on a piece of paper had a plan that made perfect sense on the paper. But you don't live in a paper world. You're on the ground living your life. And now the decree from the paper in the room comes down to you and everyone around you goes, do they not realize that if we do that, that will mean... They don't realize that. They didn't ask you, so they don't realize that. And now you're left with the consequences of that bad decision far away somewhere else. We've all experienced that. I remember working at a grocery store, which is a great place to work. And at some point, the leadership had decided somewhere that we needed to ask maybe 6 or 7 questions to every person coming through our checkout line. And if you just want to make for the most awkward, horrible interactions with customers, that's exactly the way to conquer the whole conversation with just question after question. They were frustrated, but that's how it happens sometimes. It made sense. It made sense in someone's head, but it's passed down and it doesn't make sense in real life. Now, in saying this, I don't want to stir up in anyone a kind of anti-authority sentiment. We are Christians. We respect authority. That doesn't mean we only respect authority that's good authority. We respect as well poor leaders who make poor decisions. That's a part of what it means to follow Jesus Christ. Romans 13 talks about that as well. And it's really because your ultimate leader in life as a Christian is wise and only makes wise decisions. It's Jesus Christ. That's why we submit to imperfect leadership, even like Saul here. Later, David will refuse to put out his hand and hurt Saul, even when Saul is trying to kill David, because he's the Lord's anointed. That's our view of leadership, whether secular or in the church. If someone is truly a leader, God has put them there. And your submission to Christ means submitting. If they're not asking you to sin, you're submitting to their decisions, even the illogical, unpredictable ones, as unpleasant as that is. You ask the 6 questions, you've got to do it. We can do this with confidence because we do have a King of Kings, and he's wiser than Solomon, and he sits upon his throne, and he's working in your life even through imperfect, messed up leadership making poor decisions. Amazingly. Righteous are you, O Lord, says the psalmist, and right are your rules. So you submit to lawful authority, secular government, church leadership. Lawful authority you submit to. Those who are in the house, you submit to your parents. You know they're not perfect. They know you know they're imperfect. You submit to their leadership if they're not asking you to sin, because that is a part of our submission to Christ. So I don't want to stir up any anti-authority here by commiserating about poor leadership. But at the same time, poor leadership has a multiplied impact on those who are affected by it. It's hard to live with the unpredictability if you've had a boss who is unpredictable. That's kind of what Saul. Heat of the moment, decision, suffer the consequences as the honey drips around you. It's hard to live with that unpredictability. It's difficult, too, because poor decisions from leadership, we say poor followers, not just because now there's an unpredictability in your life, but also there are heavy burdens that can fall upon your shoulders that shouldn't be put there. That's what happens here. Men in the forest, that is a heavy burden not to eat the honey they could have. And again, not being able to eat any of the spoils. The men come into Philistine camps. The Philistines have run away. The men are starving. They got through the forest. They didn't eat the honey. And now there are fatty, beefy animals all around them, just mooing to be eaten. And they can't. No one can touch them. So that is a heavy burden. It's not their fault. It's Saul's fault for his rash vow. Leaders like Saul really want results. He wants the enemy struck down. That's why he made the vow. But they don't supply what's necessary to get the results. That's the frustrating part. Last of all here, we say poor followers because the poor decisions of leaders, and this is true especially of spiritual leaders, careful how I word this, makes it easier for followers to sin. Look again this last part of our passage, verses 31 on. They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Aijalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat, and do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood." So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Now the soldiers really had sinned against the Lord. The Old Testament multiple times commanded that people were not supposed to eat any of their animals with the blood still in them. They were to drain the animals first. Hence, when Saul says, "Roll a great stone here to me," the idea is you kill the animal, put him on the stone so the blood can drain out. The people were killing the animals in their haste. On the ground, the blood stayed in. We see this, for example, in Leviticus 17:10. "If anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers who sojourn among them eats any blood," God says, "I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people." The reasoning for this was because blood represented the life, and in the Old Testament sacrificial system, it was the life of the animal that atoned for the people's sins. Of course, the reason being that it prefigured Christ's blood, which atones for our sin. It's Christ's life for our lives. So the blood was sacred. It was important. It at least was very important and was therefore not to be eaten. It was to be removed. So the people were responsible. When Saul says they've sinned, he's right. The people telling Saul said they've sinned, they're right. They really had sinned against the Lord in what they did. We're not going to excuse them of their responsibility as followers. If a leader tells you to sin, then you, like the apostles, say we must obey God rather than man. You don't do it. You don't blame them. You don't shift the responsibility like the Nuremberg trials. You just say, I made the decision. I am responsible for my decision. So the people were responsible for eating the blood. It was forbidden. With that being said, they never would have done it if Saul had been smart. If he had not made his rash vow, there'd be no reason. So what seems to have happened here is he says, no one eats till the sun goes down. The sun goes down. The people are starving. They've been looking at honey and cows all day. They're starving. So they rush, they pounce upon the animals that are everywhere because the sun just goes under the horizon. They pounce, they kill them. Maybe they cook them. But there's no time to drain out all the blood because you'd have to wait for the blood to drain. So they're eating it with the blood, sinning against the Lord. They're responsible. But Saul made the situation that led to sinning being a very easy thing for them to do. That's what we can say. And that's true of leadership. Leaders cannot make you sin. Don't blame your leaders. Say, they made me do it. However, leaders have a multiplied impact. What they can do is make it easier for you to obey the Lord or easier for you to sin against the Lord in a very powerful way. Saul is rather hypocritical here as well. I mean, notice how upset he is at the people for what? Their treachery and disobedience to the Lord. And you think the whole time, you're really one to talk, Saul. I mean, he's disobeying the Lord all the time. Romans 2 rebukes Saul's type of leader. You, the judge, practice the very same things. So Saul didn't make them sin, but he made it easy for them to sin. And that is what poor leaders do, especially in the church. Healthy doctrine taught from here, from Sunday school class, these are things that lead to healthy Christians, or at least facilitate their being healthy Christians, whereas bad, sick doctrine leads to often very sick Christians who are listening to it. So the leaders are held to a higher standard because they make it easier or harder for you to sin against the Lord. They can make you stumble, in other words. That's why you will be held responsible for all your sins, but we who lead you will be held more responsible for making it easier or harder for you. Look, we've been considering in this passage poor leaders, which is a rather negative thing. But I do want you to remember the poor leaders, the poor decisions, the poor consequences on the poor people. It is presented to you not just to dishearten you, but to serve as a warning. To serve as a warning for you, to encourage you toward the opposites. We're going to see it. Saul will be replaced by one after the Lord's heart named David. And David, in his final words in 2 Samuel, will say, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. David will refresh the people with wise, thought-out decisions that Saul, as a poor leader, did not make. You as well, no matter what kind of human leaders you are under, whatever president, whatever government, whatever church leadership, whatever boss in your workplace, whatever parents, whatever husband for a wife, parents for children, whatever your authorities are, whatever they are, you as well can rejoice that ultimately you have a wise, not a poor, but a good and a wise king and leader in Jesus Christ. One who rules justly, always makes right decisions, is never rash, has literally perfectly forethought everything, every factor, every situation. He communicates to you his decrees, his will clearly through the scriptures, provides those for you. You don't have to go to the Bible, as some people do all the time, and go, is this true? It is true. Is this right? It is right. You know that because he's a good king. He's never rash. He's never rushed. He's not too slow. He's not too fast. He is perfect in his timing, perfect in what he decrees, and the authorities in your life that are like Saul, and you probably have some of those at least, making gaffe after gaffe, putting on paper things that will just destroy your day at least, if not your life, those are there only by the authority of heaven, by the decree of King Jesus. So you're not ultimately at their mercy, but you're at his mercy. He is a chief shepherd over every under shepherd you will ever have. He is a king who is wiser than Solomon ever was. He is more pious than David ever was. He is a better reformer than Josiah ever was. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood of all our human messes. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. So take heart.